So this is chapter 13, covering distribution and homeostasis and all that fun stuff. The caption says, "Pull out, Betty, pull out, you've hit an artery." Interesting thing about mosquitoes is their proboscis goes into the skin, but there's an inner probe in a sleeve that comes out under the skin and is very mobile and searches around to find a small blood vessel to penetrate. So ever wondered, you don't necessarily have blood in your skin, it's in blood vessels. They find the blood vessels, penetrate it, squirt some anti-clotting saliva down this tube, because pulling blood through a small tube is going to clot it immediately. The turbulence which sets off the clotting is just going to set it off immediately, unless you, of course, have treated it with anti-clotting agents. But that's also why parasites pass more easily in mosquitoes, because they're literally injecting, if the parasites can get into the salivary glands, which is not that easy to do, but if they can, they're literally injected into the next host. Diffusion is passive movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And it's a pretty decent way of picking up your oxygen, because the oxygen goes into the animal and gets used. So the concentration, as long as the animal is alive, is that the oxygen levels drop. And so there's going to be less oxygen in the animal than is in the surroundings. Depends on the surroundings to some extent, just how much of an imbalance there is. It's way more imbalance around us. There's way more oxygen in the air than there is dissolved in water. But anyway, and also as waste materials are built up, they're built up. There's more inside the animal than outside. So waste materials like carbon dioxide, ammonia, other kinds of things diffuse out. That works if you're small enough. Is that we talked about this when we talked about the groups of animals. As animals get bigger, then there's going to be cells in the middle of the animal that have to be getting, if they have to be getting their oxygen from the outside world, then the oxygen is going to be going through other cells to get there. And so it's going to be harder to get it to the inner cells. If waste materials are building up on the inside and moving out, then waste materials are moving through other cells to get out by diffusion. And so there's very much limitations on size there. The flatworms came up with a way around that by being extremely flat. And that means that even in the middle is that if this is the top surface, this is the bottom surface, even the middle cells are not that far from the surface. And flatworms can get, pretty decent size. Marine flatworms can be, 4 or 5, 15 centimeters long, and 5 centimeters wide. That's unusual. Most flatworms are fairly small, though. Well, tapeworms are very long. As animals get bigger, though, this is not a way to do this. You need distribution. A lot of animals circulate fluid. The fluid goes by a surface somewhere and loses waste materials, picks up oxygen, picks up nutrients from a digestive system, and it gets circulated through the body, and then it distributes. This is distribution system. An open circulation system has a pump, sometimes multiple pumps, and spaces. Where the blood is directed through these sinuses. And it can be very complex, and the direction can be very controlled, but they're not, most of the time, the blood, such as it is, it could be blood, could be lymph, could be hemolymph, uh, is not confined within tubes. That's what makes it an open system. You do have arteries. In arthropods, especially insects, very typically the pump is ventral. It's right in the middle of the back, of the thorax or cephalothorax. And one of the more oxygen-needing organs in the body, other than the pump, of course that's getting the oxygen, is the brain. So it's not unusual for the pump to have a tube, an artery, taking blood away from the heart, that's actually long enough and actually directs blood to the brain. Very often the intake is through open slots that the pump anti-backflow valves. The pump squeezes, the blood goes out the directed way, it relaxes and opens up the valves, and the blood doesn't come back in through the artery. It comes in through these openings, which have various names. This is not the most efficient system in the world. For an animal that has particularly high oxygen needs, it is not a particularly great oxygen distribution system. So one of the ways to get around this, oxygen is not great at dissolving in fluid, in water. And the warmer the water, the less it wants to dissolve in it. And a lot of metabolic processes generate at least a certain amount of heat. Some of them generate a lot of heat. So oxygen doesn't get carried just in fluid circulating very much. But there are molecules like hemoglobin that we use that can pick up and carry oxygen, that are sticky for oxygen under some conditions and less sticky in other conditions. Did you ever think about that? Is it needs to be able to pick up the oxygen efficiently going by your lungs, air spaces, but it needs to be loose enough in the connection to release it into your tissues because your tissues need it. That's not straight up diffusion. There's slight differences in acidity and pH in those two systems, and that has a huge effect on the stickiness of hemoglobin. But iron-based hemoglobin is not the only oxygen carrier you can find out there. The next most common one is copper-based blue blood or bluish-green blood. You get in a lot of arthropods and some mollusks. Alternative distribution is something we'll come back to. Since we're talking about oxygen, there are some respiration systems that are basically respiration and distribution systems simultaneously. So we'll get to respiration by the end of this chapter. We'll come back and talk about tracheal systems and that sort of thing later. So a closed circulation system has a pump, and it has the blood contained, for the most part, in vessels. Let me move this so I can fit it on here. There may be one or more than one heart. In primitive vertebrates is that there are secondary pumps in the gills. And in fact, we have aortic arches as embryos that still are remnants, echoes of that. The distribution system very often is a multiple loop distribution system where there's a loop of blood that goes out to pick up oxygen and back, and then a loop of blood that distributes generally to the body. Um, that's possibly, I mean, that's why there's aortic arches in primitive fish, is that loop goes through the gills and then is secondarily pumped. See, here's the problem. When you send blood through little bitty vessels, you split the tubes and then squeeze the blood through little bitty vessels, it loses its push. So if you have an area where you're picking up oxygen, you got to do that through capillaries, through little bitty vessels that'll pick up stuff and distribute stuff. And so if you're pushing blood through gills, if you're pushing blood through lungs, even if you're pushing blood through the underside of the skin, which happens in some animals, then it's going to lose pressure and it needs to get another push. And in most animals, there's, like in us, we've got a pump that sends blood to the respiratory system and back, sends stuff to the body and back. In animals that really need efficient oxygen distribution, those two are completely separated by a wall in the pump, right? Question in the lab, right? Why is there a wall between one side and the other? Well, it separates oxygenated blood from deoxygenated blood. Blood going out to the lungs from blood coming back to the lungs. If you don't have real high oxygen requirements, then having just that single pump and the loops going in both directions, not that big a deal. Yeah, you're sending some oxygenated blood back out to the lungs. You're sending some deoxygenated blood back out to the body. But the body doesn't need that. It really, really charged up. The vessels, arteries carrying blood away from the heart, usually have reinforcements because there's pressure in there. And very often there's smooth muscle. There's kind of an auxiliary push. When you expand them, they contract back. And that's part of what produces a pulse. And they're stretchier. So a pulse can go through an expanded area when the heart pumps. Capillaries, veins carry the blood back to the heart after it's been distributed through capillaries, so it has very little pressure. They don't need to be really flexible. They don't need to have the muscle. They just need to be, they actually have anti-backflow valves because the blood coming through isn't being pushed very hard. And then the capillaries are your real distribution. Tiny little vessels, very often leaky, because it is easier to distribute nutrients and things you picked up from your digestive system through little bitty holes between the cells of the capillaries, rather than having everything go through the membranes of the vessels. We have what's called the blood-brain barrier, where to get into our brain, the capillaries are fairly well sealed, and everything's got to go through the membranes. It's nobody really knows exactly why. But it is a huge limitation on drug development for anything that's got to get into your central nervous system, because it's got to be able to go through those membranes. And you also have to have particular carriers in the membranes that you don't need elsewhere, because the things just leak out through the space. But because capillaries are leaky, there's a lymph system. Fluid would accumulate in your tissues unless you had a way to drain it back out. And that's what your lymph system does. It picks up this extruded fluid, and it's like a one-way system of tubes back to usually a major vein, where the fluid goes back and mixes with the blood and becomes part of the blood again. Later, we'll talk about this a little bit, but I'm going to mention it here. This is leaky capillaries is a way for your white blood cells to get out into the tissues at kind of a moment's notice when needed. If you get cut, is that a message goes out calling white blood cells in. It expands the local capillaries, makes them even leakier, and the white blood cells, which are very, amoeba-like, can squeeze out through the gaps and get out and fight things. Typically, those gaps are not big enough for, your red blood cells can't fit through the gaps, even though they're much smaller than white blood cells. But the white blood cells can squeeze their way out. But now they're out in the tissues, and the lymph system gives them a way back into the blood. So the lymph system also is kind of a collection and redistribution of white blood cell system as well. In fact, it actually has nodes where white blood cells can accumulate on it. And those will swell up. If you're fighting a localized infection, the lymph nodes will fill up with extra fluid and with extra white blood cells. And that's kind of a way, your doctor pokes in your salivary glands, lymph nodes in there to see if you maybe got an infection up here, because they will swell up. Okay, I'm going to break this up into smaller videos, so I'm going to stop this here.